developing the European capabilities in forecasting the oceans, and now she is very, very much involved in the activities of the UNESCO Decade of the Ocean by directing the Decade Collaborative Center on Coastal Resilience and by managing the Coast Predict project. Now she will talk about monitoring and predicting the global coastal ocean with some focus toward the management of environmental risk. Nadia?
Thank you, Marco. Okay, so we will do something different here. Hi, sorry. How are you? Good, thank you. Thank you, sorry. Yeah. So we'll start from a different slant, but hopefully in the future, arriving close to what you can offer to risk management. That is one of the, I think, important points in climate change adaptation research. So I'll try to show you my view, not only mine, because I took it from books, the 21st century science paradigm that has changed, and what is the contribution of operational oceanography, where I work, and what we have as important innovation, which is the Copernicus service, giving information free and open to everybody, and then talk about what I call the last mile with high fidelity coastal models and digital twin to understand how to adapt, how to prevent. So the science paradigms, we start from the empirical and descriptive one, you know very well. We arrive after the computational, that has been the one I was born with. We are going now to the data explorative one, the holistic one, and that is the era of artificial intelligence, if you want to put it in other words. So we are starting this. Many people have already started. I am personally with my group a little bit late on that, but it is the present frontier. So we have instead started in the last century and the beginning of this one to put together for the ocean what has been put together for meteorology more than 50 years before. That is monitoring continuously with the best approximation to reality that we have, that is the melding of models and observations in an optimal way. That is what we call the estimation of ocean fields. We have been able also in the past to clarify what is our audience, let's say. And our audience is the real-time observing, that is upstream of us, the routine multi-scale ocean predicting, which is intermediate part, where you produce more data, you produce at observing and predicting, and then we are now trying to get the frontier in the customized applications and the digital twin that might offer solutions to climate change issues. Okay, so this is the operational. Let me take this a bit down. Yes, I can. Maybe below.
More, then maybe there is an option to actually.
More, I can probably. Which one? The floating. Very nice. Thank you. Okay, so put it there. Okay, so there I can do also this. Yeah. Okay, so you see now the top, and we have now available as for in the meteorological community, open and free, but with the difference that is open and free, which is not a small difference. It took us a long time. 1 to 5 kilometer scales, hours, days, decades, global and regional products up to a certain point. We have up to the pelagic biogeochemistry. okay? And up to a certain level of the trophic chain, I would say the very first one. Okay, so this is available. And what is the problem? It is, as I said, open and free for discover, view, and download. And this is the address. So what is the issue here? The issue is that it is not easy to interface. We have standards that are not easily accessible for all communities. So you need to know NetCDF. That's not something you want to know, maybe. So, okay, so we are trying to do something better now in the future. So let me show you what particularly I was working with in the past 20 years is to set up this system together with OGS for the pelagic biogeochemistry, also the National Institute of Oceanography in Trieste, and the waves with the Institute of Marine Research in Athens. We have a fully coupled system with multi-expert contributions, which I think is the future. Okay, instead of putting all expert in one site, you get the expertise where it happens. And the system works operationally because now everything of the digital world allows this. So we have currents with tidal forcing, we have waves coupled partially to currents, and pelagic biochemistry, which is not giving back to currents yet, but we will. Looking, so yeah, so sea level error, just to show you where we are, the different systems. Every time we renew the system, we have to show we have advantage, we have a better skill. So here we have an error in centimeters for sea level average over the Mediterranean, and you get this from 2017 to 2022, and you see the two systems that we have been developing. And the second system, the 2020 to 23 system, is better. You know, that difference is 10%. Not bad. Okay, so we are now, every time we do a new system, we get 5–10% refinement. In the beginning, we got 30–40% refinement. Okay, so why is open ocean predictions a game changer paradigm? Okay, because offshore conditions are important for the coast. And here we show an example, a recent work with a PhD student from Georgia Tech in Atlanta, where we set up a model in the coastal that nested, which receives conditions in the open ocean at the boundaries for a hurricane, because hurricanes there are important, right? So then you can see here in the citizen science sensors. So we want that too now. Operational oceanography wants citizen science sensors because in addition to involving the population, raising awareness, we get a validation of the models. We get better validation of the models. Okay, so let me show you. This is the area, okay? Big hurricane, and that's a small area. So then we show how the model does, not bad. There is an error, especially in the relaxation after the hurricane that is here, but not bad. And then let's see what happens. Now that we have the model reproduced in reality, then we can ask the question, what is that sea level due to? And so what we did is we eliminated the local winds and we took only the sea level coming from offshore. Because, by the way, here there's only nearby, there's only the Gulf Stream. So the Gulf, I mean, it's not everywhere, right, that you get that contribution. But here we have the Gulf Stream. But people did not think about the Gulf Stream at the coast. They thought, okay. So then the blue is from offshore and is 70% of the storm surge. The rest is due to the local winds when the hurricane arrives and then the winds push the water toward the coast. That's the other part. We need also the 30% for sure. Okay, so we need open, we need to see the framework, we need to see the background. Okay, so I just will take some time to illustrate to you that the UN decade is running for ocean science, and the decade has a message which is very important, is interfacing society with oceanography. Okay, so this is particularly important when you talk about biodiversity, like in this group, and I really wish we can support you through our Decade Collaborative Center at the University of Bologna in this. Please contact us. So this is a framework, a general framework. We have now about 47 programs, 277 projects, and they are cutting across the world and transferring and understanding across the world. So it's an interesting experiment. This is the first one. I've lived through other 2 decades, you see my age, and this is an interesting one for climate change. Okay, then okay, so inspired by this famous, the science we need for the ocean we want, we started 4 years ago this UN program that is called Coast Predict, that I'm very proud to co-chair together with Professor Willy Curafolo of University of Miami and Joaquin Tintoret of the SOCIB Center in Palma de Mallorca. And with this program, we are going to redefine some concepts like the global coastal ocean. What is the global coastal ocean? And we're going to implement risk management based upon innovative technology. I'm going to go fast. So we are going to include, a big part of the land into the definition of the coastal ocean, which is, yes, found in books, but not so much, where the problem starts. And these are our test sites across the world ocean, where we'll implement new innovative technologies for monitoring. You heard about citizen science and new modeling and computing platform, cloud computing platforms. So to finish, because I think it's already time, we need to go through, a redefinition of coastal resilience components pointing into risk and not hazard, and pointing on multi-hazard and multi-risk. That is the challenge, and we don't have much yet done. I want to show you only briefly the last part, the digital twins. Okay, so what are the digital twins that need to be developed now that we have citizen science that validates the models at very high resolution in the coastal areas you have seen in Atlanta or in the Savannah area. So we have, we consult with the stakeholders, we get these observations in high fidelity models, and then we simulate what if scenarios. Okay, our what if scenarios here is, what if the clam cultivation in this bay in Italy has problems and we change the bottom, right? So what happens if I dig the bottom in these two areas? And here it is, the present condition health index. And when I dig the entrance channel, I get an improvement in this area, not what the people thought, because it's very expensive to dig that area. So people would think the health condition index would increase everywhere. Unfortunately not, because the circulation of this lagoon is very specific. And it's the impact of digging, dragging the entrance is not seen everywhere. And then change inside the lagoon, here is a smaller change, and you even have an opposite effect if you change inside the lagoon, okay? Now, the last one is clearly the nature-based solution. We believe in nature-based solutions as a solution, and so we recently published this digital twin, which shows how much seagrass in the correct positioning along our Emilia-Romagna coastal areas reduces the waves. Okay, so here we get a very big improvement. And you can do now this if you have high fidelity and good observations for validating the models. You can do it before you actually implement it. Okay, conclusions. So implementing a systemic, holistic, and data explorative approach in operational oceanography will allow, I think, new scientific developments and some of the links to societal benefit to emerge finally. Operational oceanography at global and regional scale drive the continuous improvement of the coastal. Without that improvement, we cannot arrive at the coast properly. And last, our program Coast Predicted that invites you to get in touch with us, and so has started to define standards for the development of high fidelity coastal models. And finally, digital twin are really a worthwhile methodology to be used in order to check on adaptation solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought there would be a lot of questions for the final roundtable. So hold your questions and just move to the following presentation, which is given remotely and is given by David Armstrong McKay, which is active in Exeter and also in Stockholm. And he is also working actively on resilience of social and ecological systems. So, David, if you are following us, please share your screen and you have the floor.
And apologies that you can't see my web camera because for some reason Zoom is just not picking it up, and I tried restarting and it doesn't work. So Zoom gremlins happen to show up just in the nick of time, but at least you can hear me. So yes, today I'm going to be talking to you about tipping points in the marine biosphere and in marine circulation as well. This follows up on recent research we've been doing to do with climate tipping points and Earth system tipping points, and I'll give you a bit of the latest kind of the state of the art in that field and where the future research priorities are heading towards. So this is a bit of a backgrounder to do with climate tipping points. We know that at a global scale, global warming is tracking cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. This is a figure from the latest IPCC report showing cumulative CO2 emissions on the bottom axis and the global surface temperature increase since pre-industrial on that left-hand axis there, with the historical data in black. And you can see that there's a little bit of interannual variability, but basically there's a linear increase. The more cumulative CO2 is added to the atmosphere, the more warming we're seeing, and it's a pretty direct linear relationship. On the right-hand side, there are colored lines. These are showing future model projections for temperature in 2050, with the light blue being very low emission scenarios and the dark red being very high emission scenarios. And you can see that linear relationship continues on into the future. We can expect a predictable amount of warming at a global scale. But we also know that climate impacts may not be steady. There are some thresholds in the climate system that mean that non-linear changes can be locked in at certain points. One such type of non-linear change is tipping points. By tipping points, we mean when change in some system, here some part of the climate system, becomes self-sustaining beyond some forcing threshold. An analogy I like to use is a ball passing the pivot on the seesaw if it's being pushed up it, as shown in this animation. If you start pushing a ball up a slope towards the pivot in the middle, but you let go of the ball before it reaches it, the ball will roll back down. If you stop pushing, it will return to its original state. There's some resilience there. But once it passes the pivot in the middle, even if you stop pushing the ball, it will keep on rolling until it reaches a new steady state. So it passes that tipping point, it becomes self-sustaining change in that system. And so it locks in this non-linear state shift. The main driver of this sort of behavior is what we call amplifying positive feedback loops. And the example I'm giving here from the cryosphere as an example, we have the melt elevation feedback to do with ice sheets and the loss of ice sheets. On the left-hand side here, we have a feedback loop showing how global warming can increase the temperature, the local surface temperature over an ice sheet. That increases the surface melt, as you would expect. And this causes the ice sheet to lose mass and to lose height. So it's dropping down into lower altitudes. As we all know from if you climb a mountain, at the top of the mountain it's cold. As you drop back down from the top of the mountain, it gets warmer. As the ice sheet is dropping into lower altitudes, it's getting warmer in addition to global warming as well. So that's amplifying the local surface temperature, and that causes more melt. So that amplifies the amount of melt you would expect from global warming alone on the ice sheet. Normally with an ice sheet, that only amplifies it a little bit. You get a bit of extra melting, but not it's sort of within control. But below the ice sheet's equilibrium surface, if it drops down low enough, you get into warm enough air that the melt of the ice sheet will just carry on going, even if you take away that initial global warming driver. So the melt of the ice sheet becomes self-sustaining and the collapse is inevitable. Normally in most systems, we also have stabilizing negative feedbacks as well, and that provides some level of resilience in a system that prevents runaway change. But these negative feedbacks can sometimes be temporarily outpaced, and this is what happens when you reach a tipping point. So last year, actually 2022, we published a new paper where we reassessed evidence for this sort of tipping dynamic in different parts of the climate system, where we compiled over 200 papers published since the last major assessment of tipping points in 2008. In the study, we synthesized estimates for climate thresholds, timescales, and impacts for proposed tipping systems from across the literature, including climate models, paleo records, observational data sets, and theory. And based on this definition of a self-sustaining shift beyond a warming threshold, we categorized 16 of the proposed tipping systems as having tipping points, shown on this map here, which we then separate into global core and regional impact elements. This figure shows in a bit more detail the different thresholds we take from the literature. Each of these burning embers shows the minimum to the maximum likely thresholds based on the estimates we can see. So for example, for the Greenland ice sheet, we go from a minimum estimate which is found in the literature of about 0.8 degrees, above which we say that tipping is possible but not yet likely. Most of the estimates in the literature cluster around 1.5 degrees, so we say that's the central best estimate. And then beyond that, as the bars get redder, That's showing that tipping is becoming ever more likely until we get to that maximum estimate of 3 degrees. So we repeat this for all the different 16 systems in this study. Based on that, we can look at where the different warming levels intersect with how many tipping points are becoming possible or likely. Based on this, at current warming levels, around 1.2, 1.3 degrees, 5 climate tipping points look already possible. And beyond 1.5 degrees, which is the lower end of the Paris Agreement range here in the green, in the middle of the figure, 4 of those climate tipping points are becoming likely. And by the time you get to the current policies line, the upper grey line, around about 2.7 degrees, give or take, that would make multiple climate tipping points likely to be committed if that warming level is maintained. On the right-hand side of the figure here, we're showing how many of the tipping thresholds are crossed on different emission pathways, going from the blue and green low emission pathways through to the orange and red high emission pathways. And we're currently roughly following more the yellow middle emission pathway. And we count off how many of these thresholds are passed per decade, the bottom right-hand panel C. In this, we can see that if we stick to low emission pathways, we can avoid most of these thresholds. These are the central best estimate thresholds. But there are still a few which are likely to be passed within the coming couple of decades, even if we do keep emissions very low. The caveat here is that some of these thresholds relate to really slow systems like ice sheets, which we might be able to overshoot and get back under those thresholds in time to prevent tipping by the end of the century. So there's a little bit of hope there. It should also be noted that there's mixed confidence on all of these different systems. Some of them are more confident than others. And that's also not taking account of interactions between tipping systems that might make some of these more likely. So fast forward to just a couple of months ago, at COP28, we presented this further update, the Global Tipping Points report. This was looking not just at climate tipping points, but expanding it to Earth system tipping points, looking at other drivers, not just climate change, and also how they impact societies and the potential ways we could try and stop these tipping points from happening and adapt to them if they do happen. So these are the key messages of the report. We start off with Earth system tipping points and how they pose growing threat to societies, both from the direct impacts, but also that they could potentially trigger internal tipping dynamics within societies themselves. And this is shown in this infographic by this sort of bottom leg here of Earth system tipping points leading to impacts, locking in socioeconomic impacts. This is sort of the negative pathway we want to avoid. But there's been a lot of talk recently about this idea of positive tipping points, societal tipping points that could help accelerate decarbonisation and reduce the risk of triggering some of these Earth system tipping points in the first place. This is this upper pathway here and relates to things like economic and technological tipping points and social norms as well that could help accelerate decarbonisation. And in the middle, we have this idea that we need to urgently revise governance institutions and frameworks to try and deal with some of these issues, to how to mitigate, prevent, or adapt to some of these Earth system tipping points, and also how to facilitate positive tipping points in a just way. So focusing in on section 1, which is a section I co-led along with Sina Loriani at the Potsdam Institute. Section 1 focused on the biophysical Earth system tipping points. And we worked with over 100 colleagues in this across several different chapters. And we identified over 25 potential Earth system tipping points based on reviewing the literature. We also identified that many of these systems are being destabilized, particularly by climate change, but also by other things such as habitat loss, nutrient pollution, air pollution, various different pressures which can act as co-drivers synergistically. Some of these Earth system tipping points may be close already. So we've labeled on this map here, and the pink letters show ones that are at threat because of climate change more imminently, but there are also some that are threatened more by non-climate drivers, such as rainforest dieback. And we also know that corals are already tipping in some regions already. And then again, this idea that tipping systems can interact, and in this report, we find that in general, climate tipping systems tend to destabilize each other, and this raises the risk of a possible cascade of tipping points. And finally, we also look at the idea of early warning signals, the possibility that as a system approaches a tipping point, we expect it to lose resilience, and this can be statistically detectable through monitoring data. And based on this, there's some evidence that maybe parts of the Amazon, part of the AMOC Atlantic circulation, and parts of the Greenland ice sheet may be losing resilience using this sort of technique. Zooming in now onto the marine side of things to fit phase B. So looking at the marine circulation, we look at things like the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC, which has been in the news this past week. We have medium confidence here shown by the two plus signs in this map. Indeed, a tipping system. The threshold is still uncertain though, and there's a lot of uncertainties about how exactly this could tip. But we say that in this study, it is possible and the impacts would indeed be massive. Of the aim out in recent studies is the subpolar gyre here in the Northwest Atlantic. We have medium confidence that this is indeed a tipping system as well, and it could tip separately to the wider AMOC, and it could happen sooner and faster than the rest of the AMOC as well, and that would have severe impacts across Europe and North America too. And also something in this report that's novel is separating out the Southern Ocean circulation, particularly the overturning circulation in the Southern Ocean, these pink blobs down beside Antarctica here. There's now enough evidence that in this report we categorize that as a tipping system with medium confidence, as well as the AMOC and subpolar gyre. Moving into the biosphere now, we had identified plenty of different ecosystems that have the potential for tipping dynamics as well. Most notably warm water coral reefs, which has high confidence at a local and regional scale. But we're also identifying things like mangroves and seagrass meadows have been included in this assessment for the first time with medium confidence at a regional scale. And we also have things like kelp forests, some fisheries and marine communities, and potentially also marine anoxia in some places as well, where there are feedbacks that help maintain it. We assess that regional coral tipping is already occurring in some places beyond 1 degree. About mangroves and seagrass meadows are likely at risk beyond 1.5 degrees as well. And something that's important for the biosphere in comparison to the circulation is that there's a really key role here for extreme events being the driver of ecosystem tipping. And the role also of co-drivers, it's not just a simple climate story, there's also habitat loss and pollution. And the socio-ecological aspects of these systems is key as well to understand their tipping dynamics. An example here is warm water coral reefs, where increasingly frequent bleaching means that at some point, if it bleaches too frequently, there'll be no recovery in between possible. And that's the key thing that's driving this tipping. And that's probably also what would drive the marine heat waves with seagrass meadows, for example, or more frequent tropical cyclones, the stronger tropical cyclones for mangroves. The tipping is localized, but it's becoming synchronous on a regional scale, which is why we categorize it globally. The IPCC has already assessed the extent of damage, which is potential even at 1.5 degrees, and the impacts of warm water coral reef loss would be substantial, with over 500 million livelihoods and 25% of marine life linked to coral reefs in part of their life cycle. But they're also being pressured by things like the spread of disease and invasive species, particularly disease in the Mesoamerican reef is probably more important right now as an issue, and pollution and damage as well. There's this question here of whether improving the socio-ecological resilience of these systems by supporting the sustainable livelihoods of local communities and reducing some of those co-drivers, could we help prevent or slow tipping in these systems as they're being threatened by climate change? What's the implications of all this? Well, we assess that the likelihood of passing tipping point grows above 1 degree and becomes high beyond 1.5 and particularly 2 degrees. This maps onto the IPCC's reasons for concerns, where they have tipping risks already being moderate and becoming high beyond 2 degrees. And it also maps onto various other non-tipping impacts as well. We know that there's a nonlinear increase in impacts beyond 1.5 degrees, and the ability to adapt for people becomes starts to climb beyond 1.5 and is low beyond 2 degrees as well. And this thermometer here shows where we are. We're at 1.3 degrees, and the various policies and actions that are promised at the moment, well, the actual ones that are in place would lead to around 2.7 degrees, give or take, of warming. So that would likely mean that multiple climate tipping points would be committed. As planetary boundaries are mentioned in this session as well, I thought I'd bring in how tipping points are helping to set some of these planetary and Earth system boundaries. Planetary boundaries are what we use to define the bounds of Holocene-like state. And a more recent development that I've been working on with the Earth Commission is Earth system boundaries that are complementary to planetary boundaries. But we're also setting not just safe with respect to Earth's stability, but also just boundaries as well, looking at no significant harm to a large number of people, and also minimum access to things as well. And measuring it all on the same metric. So, for example, global warming, phosphorus use, things like this. Earth system boundaries are often informed by tipping points, but they're not equivalent. An Earth system boundary is not a tipping point. The boundary is set as a guardrail before you reach any particular tipping point. So they're kind of a safe distance away is the idea behind it. Based on this, we set the safe climate Earth system boundary at 1.5 degrees because there's a high risk of tipping points beyond that point and also wider biosphere dysfunction. But we set the just boundary for climate lower at 1 degree. Because even beyond 1 degree, hundreds of millions of people are being harmed by heat extremes and sea level commitment already. Finally, some future research priorities. So we want to have better model representation of key processes, but in particular in the biosphere, things like spatial heterogeneity is important. We need risk assessments of the interactions of cascades between tipping points, monitoring and early warning capabilities, and really hammering in trying to get more societal impacts, particularly at a downscaled level, so we can actually talk to policymakers and say, this is the potential impact for your country, this is how to potentially adapt to it. And then the governance implications, all those things as well. So yeah, just to summarize, climate tipping points happen when change becomes self-sustaining in part of the climate system, locking in substantial non-linear impacts. We've identified plenty of potential tipping points in the ocean, both in ecosystems and overturning circulation. And we can say that on current emission pathways, multiple climate tipping points are looking likely. And it provides really strong scientific support for the Paris Agreement targets to try and minimize the risk of passing tipping points. This requires strong emission reductions, but also things like socio-ecological regeneration and climate resilient development in order to try and both mitigate and adapt to some of these potential impacts. And there's plenty of research that we need to do to try and improve some of these warnings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And also for you, we will put the question at the end of the session for the roundtable. You have the floor, Marilaure.
Okay, so thank you, Marco, for the introduction, and thank you to Romarin to have invited me to give this talk. So I'm going to present ocean oxygen, the role of the ocean in the oxygen we breathe, and the threat of deoxygenation. And so this talk has been produced as an outcome of the Future Science Brief number 10 from the European Marine Board. So it has been produced as the outcome of the work of a working group, and you see the people here that contribute to the presentation and to the Future Science Brief that you can download from the website. Okay, so here, what does the document cover, and what I'll be talking about is first to introduce the importance of ocean oxygen, the history on Earth's oxygen, so the atmosphere and the ocean, and the relationship of the oxygen level with life. Then we'll move to the modern oxygen cycle, oxygen in the atmosphere and the ocean again, and then current ocean deoxygenation and what are the impacts, what are the methods to study ocean oxygen, and then how to address deoxygenation through mitigation adaptation. And then at the end, we will finish with recommendation for policy, management, and also research. Okay. So the starting point of this working group and of this policy brief is really to explain the sentence, every second breath we take comes from the ocean. Probably many of you have already heard this sentence, and the question was it exactly correct, this sentence? And so first, if you want to test the public awareness about ocean oxygen, you see this sentence many times. And we realize that, in fact, there is a general awareness about the fact that the ocean is producing oxygen, so everybody knows that. But then what everybody does not know exactly is what exactly is the role of the ocean in the production of the ocean that we humans are bracing. And so really the starting point of this document is to explain what is true and what is not in this sentence. So first, to explain what is true and what is not true, we have to go back to the past, to the very long past. So starting from the Earth's creation up to now. And so what we realize, so you have here the scale of time, and here, so you see it's not linear. Is it okay? Yeah, okay. And then here you see the level of oxygen on the right. And so what we realize is that during most of the Earth's history, there was almost no free oxygen in the atmosphere and in the ocean. Then we had the great oxygenation event, which is associated to the production of oxygen by cyanobacteria, as everybody knows. And then we start to accumulate oxygen in the ocean, but this oxygen did not escape to the atmosphere first. It takes some time for this oxygen to go then to the atmosphere and to promote the emergence of life on Earth. And then we have another event, which is the Paleozoic oxygenation event, which drive a drastic increase of oxygen due to the evolution of land plants. Then we also know that 3 out of 5 of the mass extinction of biodiversity were associated to ocean deoxygenation. So we know that ocean deoxygenation can drive mass extinction, so are associated with mass extinction. And in relation to the previous talk, that's why we are calling for the definition of an additional planetary boundaries, which is linked to deoxygenation, and we have a paper which is in revision for that claim. So we also know that on the Earth, you have numerous feedback that will stabilize the oxygen cycle in the atmosphere. For instance, where you have stabilizing mechanism. And what we know is that the oxygen that accumulates in the atmosphere is due to the production of oxygen due to the burial of organic matter and of parrot in the ocean, essentially, and also in the atmosphere as concerned the burial. This burial means that some of the oxygen that is produced by photosynthesis escape the degradation by respiration and can be stored in the bottom, in the geosphere. And this sequestration is more efficient in the ocean compared to the atmosphere. And if you look at what's happened since geological time scale, since the several billion of years ago, we can say that in fact it's 86% of the oxygen human breath that comes from the ocean. So meaning that it's 6/7 breath that comes from the ocean if you look at very long time scale. Now we are also addressing the modern oxygen cycle, which means the oxygen that varies as much shorter time scale, more several thousand, several hundreds of years. So we are not speaking about billions of years here or millions of years here. And then if you look at that, we can say that currently, if we look at the oxygen production on Earth, the land and the biosphere and the ocean are producing about 50% of the Earth's oxygen. But of course, we can consider that almost all this oxygen is consumed again by respiration, by marine organisms, and by terrestrial organisms, except a very tiny fraction that can accumulate. But if you look at a time scale of several hundred or several thousand of years, this tiny fraction is really not significant. And so it means that you can consider that virtually there is no net accumulation of oxygen in the ocean and the atmosphere if you look at this time scale. You also have to know that most of the oxygen, the free available oxygen, is stored in the atmosphere, and you have very low oxygen in the ocean compared to the atmosphere. So now, if you want to wrap up, does every second breath we take comes from the ocean. In fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that. If you look at very long time scale, at geological time scale, so if you want to explain why the oxygen accumulates in the atmosphere, no. So you can, in fact, the ocean has produced 6 breaths over 7. So the sentence is not exactly correct. But if we speak about the shorter time scale, at shorter time scale, we can say that 50% of the oxygen that we all life are breathing comes from the ocean and 50 comes from the atmosphere. Okay, so now if we speak about the oxygen distribution in the atmosphere, the oxygen is distributed very homogeneously. It's very homogeneous, but in the ocean, it's not the case. You have regions where you have very low oxygen condition. And these regions, they are represented here on these maps. And the blue region represent the oxygen deficient zone in the global ocean, which are not due initially to human influence. They are regions that are naturally less ventilated than the others. But the extension is increasing due to human activities. And the red dots represent the region where you have low oxygen condition due to hypoxia. Okay, so, and what we know is also that the oxygen in the ocean is reducing since the middle of the last century. Why is it like that? In the open ocean, it's primarily due to the physics. Why? Because if the ocean is warming, you have a reduction of the solubility, you have an increase of stratification, you have a decrease of mixing and ventilation. In the coastal waters, it's due to eutrophication and the massive input of fertilizer from the lands that increase the stock of organic material, enhance respiration, and then create hypoxia on the bottom when the mixing is not able to regenerate, ventilate these bottom waters. What are the consequences? For the biogeochemistry, you have a modification, an alteration of the biogeochemical cycle, because when you do not have oxygen, when bacteria does not have oxygen, they will use other oxidant like nitrate, for instance, and doing that, they are contributing to the denitrification, which cause a loss of fixed nitrogen with potential impacts on the primary production. You can also have the production of greenhouse gases like methanes and nitrous oxide. And you also have some feedbacks that can in fact amplify the effect of deoxygenation. And here we had, in relation to the previous talk, that's also this negative, this positive feedback, the feedback that intensify the process of deoxygenation can favor the crossing of tipping points. And this feedback is due, for instance, in the coastal zone, that if you have deoxygenation, you will have an intensification of the phosphorus released by the sediment, which will amplify the production, which will amplify the deoxygenation. Of course, you also have consequences for the marine life with a reduction of the habitat, with a shift of species and change in biodiversity. This can have consequences to the ecosystem services with, for instance, reduction of fisheries, change in the carbon sequestration and uptake mechanism. What is the challenge is to scale up the local effects at global scale and to see what's the global consequences of ocean deoxygenation. How do we study deoxygenation? We have, of course, the observation, and here the sensor, the advent of sensor and autonomous platform have dramatically changed our knowledge of ocean oxygen. We have an increase of data that was absolutely outstanding, and now the numbers of data due to the sensors during the last decades is almost equivalent to the number of data that you had since the middle of the last century. Still, the monitoring of oxygen deficient zone is problematic, and also the modeling remains challenging because they are very challenging in terms of monitoring. For instance, the wind cloud methods has deficiency in this region, and for the modeling as well. if we talk about more long-term record, we have the sediment beds that are very important. The information that you have there is very important, especially if you want to investigate what is the past, what's happened in the past, why in the past you have this extinction event, what's the relation with the oxygen, how the oxygen, what's the velocity of the oxygen change in the past, and that drive this biodiversity crisis, and where are we now in terms of change of oxygen and velocity of the oxygenation. Modeling, of course, so Nadia talked very well about coastal models. And of course, so coastal modeling is very important because you have this problem of hypoxia. And as Nadia say, coastal model needs boundary condition at the open sea, but also from the atmosphere and from the lands, which is still a challenging problem for the oceanographic community. And Earth system models, they also have their challenge in terms of resolution, in terms of forcing, etc. So mitigation and adaptation, what can we do? So of course, to limit global warming. And we know that if we limit global warming, this will stop the ocean deoxygenation in the upper ocean. For the coastal zone, we have to reduce the eutrophication and to implement management strategies. And of course, here, the combination of models and data are very important. We can also have the blue, the development of blue ecosystem can help to oxygenate the coastal waters. But these habitats, they are also impacted by human activities, and they are also restricted to very small regions. So the mitigation action can be quite limited. We also have engineering addition of oxygen. There are systems that are proposed to reoxygenize the waters, and locally it seems that it works. But again, here we have to be very careful and to look at the non-local side effects that can, in fact, reaccelerate the deoxygenation because you can change the physics. The deep sea is already experiencing deoxygenation. We know that it's it's something that is known, and this will continue. And so it's very important to reduce the other stressors that affect the deep sea ecosystem and to increase the protection. Recommendation. So we conclude with recommendation for policies and for the management. So first, to recognize that the ocean deoxygenation is also a major threat. And so we have this paper that called for considering deoxygenation as a 10th planetary boundary to reach the net zero greenhouse gas emission, to stop the upper ocean deoxygenation, to limit the runoff of nutrients, to reduce the stressors ecosystems that are already impacted by deoxygenation, especially, for instance, the deep sea, but the coastal one as well, and to increase their protection. To include ocean oxygen in future projection by, for instance, IPCC, IPBS, and in the high-level framework for planetary health, so the SDG, for instance. And to promote the following statements about the role of the ocean in the oxygen we breathe to provide the most accurate information. So the ocean produces 50% of the Earth's oxygen. Every second breath taken by all the life on Earth comes from the ocean. But since the origin of life on Earth, the ocean has provided most of the oxygen in the atmosphere and is responsible for 6 of 7 breaths the human take. To finish, the recommendation for the funders, the research and the monitoring stakeholders, the people, we have to fund and perform research to better understand the historical, the current, and the future ocean deoxygenation rates, to understand the biological, chemical, and physical processes that control oxygen dynamics. We have to increase the ocean oxygen observation and modeling efforts to ensure that all the oxygen data is compared and shared and feed the global databases to accurately document and predict ocean oxygen changes. And we have a decade program, which is the Good Ocean Oxygen Decade program, that is also trying to push towards this recommendation and to put action toward this recommendation. We have to develop new low power and low cost oxygen sensors to include the oxygen in the multiple stressors of marine environment, and to fund and perform the research to better understand how the ocean deoxygenation will impact marine life, from population to ecosystem and ecosystem services, and then to gain a better understanding on the vulnerability of ecosystem services and society and our economy to deoxygenation. And that's it. So thank you for your listening to me.
Thank you, Marilaure, and please stay online for the final roundtable. And now we move to the last but not least, talk by Eliza Fragkopoulou, which is working in Portugal, but she's from Greece. Yes. And she will talk about hot in every sense topic that she's dealing with, the effects on marine heatwaves on biodiversity.
So thank you very much for coming and listening. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how heat waves characteristics from the surface to the deep ocean, and how they might expose biodiversity to extreme conditions. Over the recent decades, one of the most pronounced effects of temperature anomalies is the mass mortality events that have been transforming coastal ecosystems globally, actually. And this is an example from this region in the Mediterranean Sea, where basically Gorgonia and coral die-offs were quite extent, starting maybe back in 1993, 1999, 2003, and many times afterwards, due to probably temperature anomalies that also might have caused diseases, and we don't know very much about how the whole ecosystem changed. Another example, it's the kelp forest collapses. This is an example from Western Australia, where a heat wave in 2011 completely transformed these productive forests of kelp into completely degraded regions, with very little recovery years after the events. So as the events of temperature anomalies are becoming more common, and as their effects were becoming very well known, Hobday and colleagues in 2016 came together to provide definition of these events based on the counterparts of the terrestrial heat waves. So what they did is that they called any temperature anomaly during that at least lasted 5 days, and it was above a threshold of temperature. They call it the heat wave. So a heat wave has a starting date, an ending date that defines its duration, and it also is characterized by its intensity, which is basically how many degrees above the climatology of the region, above the threshold, we have monitored in this region. And this definition of heat waves boosted scientific publications, and today we have hundreds of publications looking into characterizing heat waves and their effects on biodiversity. And what we know so far is, first of all, heat waves are driven by climate change and overall the global warming of the ocean. This is why they're becoming more frequent. They're increasing in strength, in duration, and also in extent, distribution. And then again, we expect them to become much stronger in the future and more frequent as warming of the ocean continues, with multiple socioeconomic impacts. I showed you the massive mortality events. We have species shifting their distributions. We have fisheries collapses, you name it, algal blooms or whatever. The majority of studies, though, looking into heat waves, they were based on sea surface temperature, because they didn't have a lot of daily data, because we were working on a daily scale for many years, usually 30 years climatology, to estimate heat waves. So some local insights from moorings during events in Australia and the Northeast Pacific showed some surprising observations. First of all, we found that there was higher intensity in the subsurface compared to the surface waters. And then sometimes this warming would last much longer after the surface event. In some cases, they found in the California region that the heat wave in the subsurface or the warming would last up to 2 years after the surface event. And then again, sometimes the warming would be observed without any signal in the surface of a heat wave. And we didn't know if these are localized observations. Do they have a pattern? Do they occur around the world? So as actually Nadia was saying before, we needed to have a global characterization of subsurface heat waves. I corrected this before. I don't know why this says again. I'm sorry for this slide. We corrected it in the morning. So Nadia was saying we took advantage of the Copernicus Marine Service that has a huge data set of temperature from 1993 to 2019 at the time, from the surface to 2,000 meters depth, and we tried to estimate different marine heatwave metrics across the global ocean. So we estimated metrics such as heatwave intensity, their duration, the number of events, and what we call cumulative intensity, which is basically an estimate of a thermal proxy. It is the integral of intensity over time, and it's a way for us to compare different heatwave events and to see how much they might be stressing the organisms. For example, a heat wave that has maybe an intensity of 3 degrees but lasted 10 days, is it comparable to a heat wave that has an intensity of 1.5 degrees and lasted 20 days? So this is how we can compare through cumulative intensity. And we use this data, and I'm showing you here a little bit depth time plot. You have the time from 93 to 2019 and the different depths that we worked on, and we actually show that climate change is gradually warming up the ocean across depths, and you can see that from 2011 onwards we have quite larger temperature anomalies reaching 0.6 degrees. Then we looked into the global averages of marine heatwave metrics with depth, and I'm showing you here on the first plot maximum intensity, number of events, and the mean duration. And we found that maximum intensity actually peaked around 100 meters depth, and it was as high as the surface down to 200 meters depth, which was surprising. And although the number of events decreased with depth, their duration increased, and it got up to twice as long compared to the surface at 2,000 meters depth. It was something very surprising to us. Here I'm showing again the same metric. So this is intensity and hide me. Right. There you go. So you have maximum intensity, number of events, and mean duration, and the geographical extension. And if you see from the maps, we can see that maximum intensity was higher in regions of boundary currents, where actually events were also more frequent. And then we also found very high marine heatwave intensity at 100 meters depth across the equator. And when we were looking into their duration, we found that, of course, it increased with depth, but in polar regions, marine heatwave durations were quite lasting very long, up to 3 years in some cases. Then we wanted to see what can be the biodiversity exposure to marine heat waves. So we used distribution range maps from about 25,000 species, marine species, to estimate local richness and by depth based on their distributions. And then we overlaid this with cumulative intensity to identify regions of richness exposure. And what I show here of low exposure is regions where low cumulative intensity overlaid with low species richness, And as high exposure with this red wine color is regions where high cumulative intensity overlaid high richness, species richness. And we found that because cumulative intensity was higher in the upper 250 meters of the ocean, richness exposure was higher in those depth ranges, but we also identified other high risk exposure regions below those depths. Considering that species that live closer to the thermal tolerance limits may be more sensitive to heat waves, we defined their warm edge exposure. So what did we do? We based on temperature, we divided the species distribution ranges into terciles, corresponding to a cold edge distribution, to a middle, and to a warm edge distribution. I can give you an example. Let's say a species occurring from Morocco all the way to the UK along the Atlantic coast would have a cold range distribution around the UK and maybe northern France, a middle distribution around Spain and maybe Portugal, and then the warm edge distribution, South Portugal to Morocco. So stacking together the warm edge distribution of species, we got what we call a warm edge exposure, and then we overlaid that with the cumulative intensity to identify those regions where species are usually living closer to the thermal tolerance limits. So once again, we found that warm edge exposure was higher from the surface to 250 meters depth, but the largest areas occupying up to 22% of the ocean were found in the deep ocean from 500 meters to 2000 meters depth. Then we looked into regional patterns of marine heat waves in different regions of oceanographic conditions. And in this map, we have like five different regions. With A letter, we have boundary currents. With B, I have the region around the Antarctic circumpolar current. C are subtropical gyres, and then D, it's tropical gyres, and I have also some points in the Arctic, which is a hotspot of warming. And we looked into these localized examples to see if there are different patterns. And today I'm going to show you boundary current A, which is the Gulf Stream, region C1, which is the subtropical gyre in the Pacific, and then the tropical gyre in the Indian Ocean D2. And we found quite different patterns of marine heat wave intensity. So this is in depth and time. And on the side, I have cumulative intensity with red, species richness, and warm edge exposure from those localized regions, like 1 degree regions at the time. So in boundary current regions, you can see that marine heat waves intensities are quite strong, reaching up to 7.5 degrees. And usually heat waves occur from the surface all the way to almost 1,000 meters depth, with higher cumulative intensity being in the first 500 meters of the ocean. As you can see, heat waves occur very often, they're quite frequent, as we saw also from the maps in the beginning. And then looking into the subtropical gyre, we see that heat wave intensity is actually lower compared to the boundary current, a maximum of 3 degrees, but usually the strongest heat waves occur above 100 meters, which is basically the thermocline depth at the time, okay? And you can see that they're long lasting because these are daily observations, so when it's continuous, it lasts more days. Of course, heat waves occur below the thermocline depth, but they are much weaker. Now, in tropical gyres, the pattern is again different. We find quite strong heat waves of up to 5 degrees, between 75 and 150 meters depth, once again coinciding with the thermocline depth. And what is interesting is that sometimes heat waves occur without a signal from the surface, or if we have a signal at the surface, they are much weaker there. Summarizing what we found is that indeed subsurface marine heat waves are quite stronger and last longer throughout the globe, and not only in those regions that they were first observed. And then that biodiversity is exposed to their effect mostly from the surface to 250 meters depth. Our observations mostly come from shallow regions, and this is why we really need to focus on monitoring much deeper or offshore regions to see if indeed impacts are recordable on the biodiversity and the marine organisms. So, okay, what I wanted to say here is that regional patterns are quite different, and we can see that from the different oceanographic regions with completely different characteristics. And this is why we cannot only rely on surface temperature to understand what is happening well below the surface waters. Then in polar regions, subsurface marine heat waves were lasting much longer than in other areas, but I have to tell you that the Copernicus dataset that we're using has the largest uncertainties in data in those regions. However, I was finding new evidence from Antarctic and Arctic moorings, recording some borealization of the deep basins in these areas from subsurface warm water flowing into from the Atlantic and from the Pacific Oceans, which basically support our findings of warming in those areas. And this warming, in combination with species expanding the distributions poleward to track climate, may add some pressure to the polar ecosystems, and we have to keep monitoring them. Then for the deep ocean, we found that heat waves are quite weaker compared to the surface. They're usually less than 1 degree in intensity, but they're very long lasting. And we don't have much observations from the deep sea. Sometimes I found some evidence from a 0.4 warming that changed the richness and abundance of those regions. So we don't know if we have impact and what the impacts can be. This is why we really need some monitoring from the deep sea. As future perspectives, again, systematic monitoring, having time series data before, during, and after heat waves would be amazing to see what are the effects on organisms and if there are any. And then as a potential future work, research should actually consider the synergistic effects of oxygen declines. We've already spoken about these. The ocean is becoming less and less oxygenating, and thus they can combine these estimates of low oxygen with high temperature and see maybe how do they affect biodiversity by using animal tracking data and see if there are any behavioral changes. Basically, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, I do thanks the 4 speakers for keeping perfectly the time. And so the round table is now open if there are questions for the people following or also remotely. And really, if you can see if there are raised hands somewhere, or of course we can take the question from the floor here. Here.
I can start. I know that there are others that are in the line for questions, but it's actually a question maybe for all of you, because in different contexts you all mentioned about the needs and the different type of requirements for ocean observations. I think Nadia mentioned the use of ocean science, citizen science type of approach, while David was mentioning, or I mean, he has been illustrating how to process this long-term time series, and it would be nice to elaborate a little bit about where are the data coming from, and also what are the bottlenecks in terms of acquisition of this data, and I suppose it's the same also for the marine heat waves part. And for Marilaure, actually, she also mentioned the need of new observations, and I was wondering what is the role of Argo floats and the oxygen sensor on Argo floats. But maybe Nadia can start, because the coastal oceans are actually those that have, although it's paradoxical, more observation for the open ocean than for the very coastal region. So, is there any research in that direction?
So thank you for the question. Am I speaking this way? This one?
No.
No, it's already there. Okay, good. I just wanted to be sure. Yeah, actually, it is a paradox. I would say that we had observations all the way from the, in the past, but the innovation of real-time data that has come in the open ocean as a necessity has not shown up until now so evident for the coastal. And what it implies when you have real-time data transmission, it implies that you have standards and that you can disseminate the standards and get more people using the data of others, and also comply with, these guidelines. So it is a structuring of the oceanographic community that has occurred during the 90s for the open ocean, and for the coastal area has been left behind. So that's why in the decade we are trying to overcome and go on low-cost sensors, efficient, also energy efficient sensors, and there are now, at least that I know of, 5 to 10 projects of the UNDK that have put together the community in sensor development that will start to draft the guidelines. And that is very important, because if you don't have that, is a problem. Now, after that, we need to uptake this as single researchers and people around the world, the program, the nations, and so on. But for the time being, I think the UNDK has a good catalyzing effect on citizen science. And I think it's very, very mature, the time in which we can finally have key instrumentation, and some of them are for water quality. So water quality, we have already a few commercial sensors for monitoring. I don't know the accuracy of oxygen, Marilaure can say better. We also have a lot of air-sea air sensors in the coastal area that are becoming standard. So to get pollution from the atmosphere, we know that pollution will arrive from the atmosphere more than from the rivers, because the rivers are going to get without. And last, if I can say, there is another big innovation that is coming, and is that we are missing data, but also we are now for sure, we are certain that all the data we use is not well used by the global south. So this is a serious concern by the UNDK, and also they don't give data, and so the citizen science is one way. The cost-effective monitoring is a way that they can probably arrive at a good level of monitoring of their coastal areas and sharing of the data. Yeah, so that's I can say. Yeah.
And there was if Marilaure has to say something, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. So I have several comments regarding Patricia's question, which is very important. As concerned the numbers of data and BG and Argo, I guess that for the biogeochemistry, it's still challenging. So you know that Goose has the aim to deploy 1,000 Argo floats that will have the 6 sensors as concerned biogeochemistry, so oxygen, pH, light, so fluorescence, nitrate, I guess. So okay, there are 6 sensors. So the target aim is 1,000. So I'm not sure that we will get that. No, what we have is about 10% of the Argo flow that are deployed in the ocean contains oxygen sensor, which mean more or less 300, 400 Argo flows have oxygen compared to the 3,000 or 4,000 flows that you have in the ocean. So still for BGs, for the biogeochemistry, and even worse for the biology, the availability of data is still missing, but Argo has a lot of promises to fill the gaps here. Then as concerned the when data are collected, they are not always available. So that's the problem. And the coastal ocean is really problematic, as Nadia was mentioning. We realized that in the GOAN, so the Global Ocean Oxygen Network, which is a network from the UNESCO, so IOC UNESCO, we realized that if you look at maps of oxygen data in the coastal ocean, you see that you have big gap in some region of the world, and probably these data are collected, but they are not delivered to the database. Then, so the delivering of data, so the collection of data is important, but when data are collected, it's also important that it goes to the database. And when it goes to the database, it's important that the quality control is optimal, because now the user want to know the quality of the products. And in information on the quality of the products, of the data, is essential, and it can be improved. For oxygen, it can be improved. You have this calibration of the Argo with the AC flux, which is very important. So this calibration can be improved. And then a last point, for the users and for oxygen, we try to promote that. It's very important for any data you are considering to have a single place where you can download all the data, and not needing to go to the world, to EMOTNet, to different places to take the data, to search for duplicates, to compare the quality control, to compare the quality flagging. That's really complicated. So we really need also, for the data that we have, to try to have a kind of single place where the user can go with consistent quality flagging and quality control procedure, and we are not there, at least for the biogeochemistry and at least for oxygen. And that's really an effort that we try to promote in the community, but it's not easy to be listened and to find the support, because we need data managers, we need technical people to do that, and it is very important. So more data, but we have the data, and for this data we also need to manage them maybe a little bit better. Thank you.
And then when it comes to heat waves or extreme events, the data are becoming daily, or they should become daily, because they're changing quite fast. And then again, we have problems in collecting them. Maybe for the coastal regions, we are a little bit better for the monitoring, but offshore and deep regions have a lot less data. We are using Copernicus reanalysis data that they have their own flows, but actually at least the temperature is quite well calibrated when I compare it to independent data. Oxygen is a lot poorer, also in resolution and in quality, something that has to change. And citizen science might help with the coastal regions, but it has to be really organized for the different parts of the ocean. Not only providing, collating, cleaning, flagging data, but also giving them in a nice way to scientists for to use. There are huge amounts of information coming in every time.
Thank you very much. If there are other questions? Yes, please.
I have a question for Eliza. I'm sorry, I was far away to understand all your speech before, so I'm sorry for that. Maybe I missed the source of information you used in your study about the biodiversity data. I mean, I understand you consider a set of marine species, but I didn't catch something, your source of information for.
The biodiversity information came from aquamaps. So these are the distributions of species. There are models showing habitat suitability, basically. So distribution range maps of species, and it gives us an estimate of where most species are, right? So this was the biggest data set that I had with more standardized format to know where species are. And this, I overlaid that with estimates of heat waves to see if actually regions where you have recurrent heat waves have higher biodiversity or not. And if you can see that as a response to the species richness.
Okay, which is more or less the temporal extension of this.
So AlphaMaps it's a one layer. So it has the distribution of the species from basically the last 20 or 30 years point, but it doesn't have like a temporal changes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cosimo?
Yeah,
Speak loudly.
yeah,
Because the Microsoft is.
I will try to do loud enough. So my other question for you, just related to this one, and you were comparing the occurrence of marine heatwaves with these thermal tolerant thresholds.
Yes.
I was just wondering whether or not these thermal tolerant thresholds are size dependent. Because I mean, the same species may have a different adaptation in different parts of the world. So that was a question.
Completely. You are completely right. I mean, there are studies that they test thermal tolerance to species with wide ranges, and the ones that are live closer to higher temperatures, they have better tolerance than those living into colder temperatures, let's say. But it was an estimate to see, because there are also other studies showing that when species are very close to their thermal tolerance limits, they're very easily crossed when you have a very strong heat wave. And their effects are bigger. So this is why we wanted to provide also that information. You have to have better time series data to confirm. This was like an overview of where species have their upper tolerance limits, and then compare it somehow with the cumulative intensity of heat waves and see regions of high risk. Let's say.
Thank you. And if I may, I have a quick question to Nadia. Yeah. And so my question is related to your discussion of digital green ocean and the science to policy interface. I mean, we know, unfortunately, that model and science still have limitation, right? So, as an example, you show these studies in the Saccarigoro for climate agriculture and the scenario analysis. Still, even if I'm not familiar with the specific studies, I guess that you were not able to put everything inside. I mean, maybe there was hydrodynamic, but maybe there was not geomorphology or in the biochemistry, or maybe yes, but for sure not everything, or not this case. Meaning that maybe in your scenario analysis, you were not able to take in consideration some important processes that will happen in decades, like sediment movements. And so, how do we deal with stakeholders and science to policies interface in explaining our lack of knowledge without saying that we do not know anything? I mean, we know enough to provide support and something, but this is not an easy message to send over.
Yeah, this is a very important question. So uncertainty management for interfacing with policymakers can be taken from a very practical point of view, or let's say technical point of view, which is we have several possibilities. We can do ensemble, we can use different models, we can do multi-model and single model perturbations and see. It's clear that if you don't have the process, we don't have the process, so it's not a question. But these digital twins, that's the key, are different from the, say, classical numerical models, and hopefully to the new AI models that are coming, because they try to have the maximum reproduction, the maximum complexity. So it's maximum complexity. It's the exact opposite of the reductionist approach that allows you to understand. But here we are trying to reproduce. Okay. So, but anytime, you're totally right. You know, when you work with models, you have uncertainty growing from many other technical parts that are not even the processes, which are the important ones. So I think that using the traditional uncertainty estimation that is used in IPCC, how does a PCC deal with uncertainty? And they have large uncertainty. It deals with multimodal uncertainty estimation. So it does multimodal ensemble. So ensemble, this is the technical part. How to communicate this uncertainty in order, in a way, to foster a precautionary principle. I mean, we don't need to wait until we know every single detail before we know we have to act in a certain way, and we can show solutions. So the digital twin are also to check the solutions, which is the novelty, another novelty. High complexity, and then solutions. You check for solutions. This is something that is still in evolution, but it is clearly a very useful tool, I have to say, when we talk with policymakers. Or I'm even more than that, because I don't talk to policymakers so frequently. I talk more to intermediate users. So the people that then will bring their understanding from our work to the policymakers. The example, we talk to the Environmental Protection Agency. We don't talk to the regional officers that are the policymakers. But if the Environmental Protection Agency has this concept of digital twin to use for checking solutions, it would be very useful. So the word is that this new technology that has come recently in our area, in industrial development, has been from it, is promising for talking to policymakers for solutions. And I think we should embark on attempts to see what we can solve at this moment. And again, we have to act. We have no time. We can't wait for very long to say we have explored all the possible processes. We know that. Yeah, so that's...
Yes, thank you very much for this very enlightening series of talks. And it's impressive what has been possible with the technological innovations over the past years. My question would be related, how do we actually scale this up to the biology? Because kind of your view stops at the chemistry, the physics, and maybe phytoplankton, but it's actually the small critters in the oceans that are sustaining, you know, the ocean productivity and also the carbon pump. So how would you advise that we as a community move forward to actually get attention on this understudied part, and what is needed to actually include it? Difficult question. I'm not sure how to respond to that. What is needed to include it? I mean, all of these are, what, at least for my part, this is completely model and theoretically driven. So we need to have confirmation in the water, right? And especially all of these regions, deeper parts, far away from the coastal ecosystems and what's happening. That only comes with monitoring. Now, how we can ask for it? Through asking more money for science, right? I mean, everything is changing, and we need to keep up with the changes and monitor and observe.
For me, is standardization. So you know better than me what it means for biology standardization. So, but you know, and technological innovation to get as much as possible real time. So that's my very brief answer. Maybe Marilaure has something to say.
I'm not sure I have understood the question. So the question is how to convince about the use, the utility of the data. Is that the question?
No, it's how do we expand? So why don't you come here?
No, I think, I mean, maybe we need to think big, you know, have a flow cam and UVT on every Argo float, you know, I mean.
Yes, yes.
I mean, but this would require huge amounts of resources.
I would say that beyond the standardization, also the technological improvement is going to make the difference. The reason why maybe physics goes faster than biology is that taking a temperature measurement in the ocean is much easier than analyzing a plankton sample. So today, during the oyster session, we have seen that you can start identifying species by the backscattering, for instance, or something. So having this capacity to improve your skill in observing the ocean and in reasonable time, that would make the difference.
And using AI to identify. I mean,
not to mention AI. Okay, so there is a question from the yes.
We have a question online.
Klausia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So this question is for Dave. So within the recent years, there has been a lot of focus in these nature-based solutions for regulating the climate. So because it's just not enough for us to reduce emissions, we actually need to do some bioengineering. Like we need to use kelp in seaweed farms to be able to control like this carbon sequestration. So I wonder what Dave actually thinks about that, because my worry is that there is a lot of hype that we need to take shortcuts to control the amount of CO2 we release in the atmosphere, but maybe it is a good idea that we need to act. So I wonder if he has any opinion about that.
Yes, I would tend to agree with you that there is potential, but there's also a lot of hype out there to do with the possibility for natural climate solutions to try and remove some CO2. In general, what I've seen from the best estimates out there is that maybe through various natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions, we might be able to do a peak shaving approach, that we might be able to shave off 0.2 to maybe 0.3 degrees of an overshoot going over 1.5 degrees, when you're also considering technical, ecological, and social feasibility of various solutions. A lot of these are based on land, and there have been quite a few proposed in the ocean, like kelp farming that you mentioned. But whenever I've been reading into these papers and some of the discussion and critiques of these papers, there's always the issue of knock-on effects. For example, with mass kelp farming, you're effectively removing nutrients from the ocean for other marine communities as well. So that there's a question mark as to whether you're actually overall increasing marine productivity, or whether you're just shifting it to a different part, and that has a knock-on ecological impact for all those marine communities that you're basically stealing the nutrients from instead. So in general, I think there is some promise out there, but I'm in general tending towards skepticism about the scope of some of these solutions. I think there is enough there to maybe help a bit with maybe reducing the peak warming somewhat, but we shouldn't over-rely on it. We shouldn't pursue them if they're going to have massive ecological impacts, given that there's all these other drivers of ecological change and biosphere degradation that need taking account of as well.
Okay, thank you. And you have a question, and then there's. Please.
Yeah, first of all, answering your question, this afternoon there will be one introduction of the concept of operational marine biology, and it goes to that direction. And within that talk, you will see that citizen science has an important role. But one of the things that we have engaged many people is because we are providing them some types of return, in a sense that they are very good data producers. And in a more general, concept of framework, you always mention this need of more and better data. And I think that now what we have is that within the open science new framework, I can be very good on analyzing data, and maybe I'm really bad on producing data, but it doesn't matter because there are several sources of information which I can download, and I have imagination or good ideas, how to analyze that data, and this will be very well recognized. I can publish, and then my paper will be highly cited, and that's fine. But what about the data producers? And I think that probably we need to change a bit, the way it's acknowledged these data productions, in a sense that we need, in my view, that those people that are really good on producing data, taxonomers, citizen scientists, whoever, these new technologies of low cost, if they are really good on that, how to acknowledge them or how attribute them the good reputation, because I think it's essential, to acknowledge the contribution of all this community in a sense that they are producing the really good data that later on can be fed in digital twin of the oceans, analysis or whatever. And I think we are missing a little bit this, and I would like to know your opinion on that.
Thank you. Do you have to say something, or Nadia, or even Marilaure, or
Yeah. It was indeed what I would have liked to mention about the answer of the question that has been asked about biological and biogeochemical data, why it lags behind the physical data. Just as you say, Marco, because the automatic sampling of the biology and biogeochemistry is more challenging compared to the one of the physics, and then to show that the biological and biogeochemical data are important, we have to realize this observing impact assessment, which means to integrate this biological and biogeochemical data in our models to see how we improve the prediction, how the high quality information is important for the user. But for doing that, again, here, the biogeochemistry and the biology, we are a bit behind the physics in terms of data assimilation because it's more complicated, and in terms of modeling, because biological and biogeochemical model are more empirical. But I guess that the next decade would be really the opportunity to have a big improvement on our modeling system, data assimilation system, supported by all this new observation in biology and biogeochemistry, and then to try to have a kind of coordination in the community to perform this observation impact assessment for the biology and for the biogeochemistry. And just to say a word about that, WMO is organizing a workshop in May about this observation impact assessment. The ocean is there. It's new, but it's not totally new, but no, it's more reinforced. And we start to have biology and biogeochemistry, essentially biogeochemistry and CO2, which is quite good. So we are going in that direction, but we still have a lot of progresses to do, I guess.
Thank you, Marilaure. There's a question from the audience.
Yeah, this is speaking from the British Institute. Following a little bit up on this related to biochemistry, so both temperature and oxygen will affect cycling of key nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Also, temperature will affect stratification. So my question is really, should we be worried that primary production in the ocean is going to decrease in the future?
Yes, we are. No, I mean, that's one of the big questions related to the, speaking loosely, the warming of the ocean. So that's stabilizing more the ocean, reducing the flow of nutrients. So it's going to be, it's very, very big question.
So the negative feedback elements here that we see or should see, which will to change the balance, or do we just see reductions?
This is something that is more related to reaching now, I think, to the reaching a sort of tipping point in some sense, to me. But Nadia?
Yeah, so I guess, yes, I would be worried not only by deoxygenation, which I think is a top priority, but also the lack of eutrophication that we are facing in the Mediterranean, definitely, and in the Black Sea too. And this has to deal with the connection with the sources, but also the increase in stability of the water column if your coastal area is connected to the offshore for nutrients uptake, for nutrients upwelling. So I think that we need to see the whole system as a whole, and what is, in my opinion, important is that in the next years, I agree with Marilaure, is that more and more biology and biogeochemistry couples with modeling and shows predictive capabilities. Because we have made that error also in the physics for a long time. Before Operation Oceanography came, sort of the forecasting was kind of, you know, not a very important enterprise, human enterprise. I can assure you, we started very few to do forecasting. Why do you do ocean forecasting? And so it was, so using forecasting as one of the major means for deciding observations and so on is a key to solve the problem, not only to qualify the scientists or so. It's really to solve the problem, because it's through forecasting that you check the model. It's not when you have, you know, you assimilate the data also, because if you assimilate sometime, if the model is too far from reality, you cannot assimilate, so you cannot estimate. So you need to have the real tool is the forecasting, and for biology, I think is still on the frontier, but it has to be mission focused, meaning that if you have, you know, if you don't have it in your list of priorities, forecasting never becomes an important issue. And to have an observing system that fits the best the needs for forecasting, you decide on which time scale, 10 days, a month, 2 years, you know, there are different options. Then, you know, it really helps to understand what is basic, what is really needed. So I think that is a very important framework to introduce forecasting as a way to judge the experimental or the needed observations for the rest of the biogeochemistry. And so I think I would recommend strongly to undertake that paradigm as a way to check if the observing system is in place.
Thank you. So we are over time, but I have a very quick question for Eliza. Maybe David might also comment. So conceptually, I have some problem with putting under the same heading and another warming during few weeks and the one during 3 years.
Yes.
So few weeks is a wave. 3 years is a long storm, so that is the best way. So are you considering this difficulty, and is it hypothetically possible to think about this anomalous warming, local waves, that the longer and the wider, the closer the tipping point?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So, the research on wave is trying to discriminate between I mean, a spike and a very long period of it. It's the same, I guess, for the atmosphere.
Sure. So the conversation nowadays is when we forecast heat waves in the future, what baseline do we use?
Yeah.
Do we use the conditions of today?
Mm-hmm.
Or when we want to forecast heat waves in 2080, the whole background of the ocean is actually in a state of heat waves, right? The system is moving. So the idea now is to forecast heat waves in the future using 30 years before the moment you want to forecast it.
Okay.
What happened in the deep sea, it's because it's so much more stable and you have a lot less mixing than in the surface water. You basically we were observing a heat wave of very small intensity, it can be 0.05 degrees. But still, it's anomalous for the area.
The surface might depend in the change in the ocean atmosphere exchanges, but if you are
We are looking
1,000 meters deep, that's
exactly
many things are.
sure, but I think that we are looking at the same point from two sides, warming. That's it. So either you want to look at it where fast and acute events or gradual warming, and I think that is what we were receiving there.
Yes, so there is a conceptual difference.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So it's time to lunch. I do thanks all the four speakers and all the people that discussed today. The lunch is downstairs and we will reconvene at 2 o'clock around. Thank you very much.